Hello, Dreamcatchers, and welcome to another exciting day in the Writers Haven. We are shooting live on location in Atlanta, Georgia at the National Book Club Conference. And with me today is one of our featured authors who have you already had your talk or your...
Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m.
Okay, Dreamcatchers, this is Harriet Lee Elam-Thomas, and she is the author of the book Diversifying Diplomacy. And she is actually a very unique author. This is her first book, but she actually did somewhat of a career change to get to this journey. So we're going to talk to her about that career change, amongst other things. But let me start with my list of questions. The first question I have for you is, for the book, what inspired you to write it?
The fact that I was married to a gentleman who said to me, "You have a story to tell." And I taught university students diplomacy, and they often would say, "Ambassador, what you tell us in terms of your life experience running that embassy is far more important in terms of our grasping the theory of international relations than reading yet another book that's filled with nothing but theory and not practice." So I realized that it was important to try to share that experience in the written word. And that was part of the inspiration.
Okay, but why was it important to write?
I was part of a career that is not considered run-of-the-mill. I was not a doctor, a lawyer. I was not a university professor, a teacher. I was not a firewoman or fire person. And I was in a field that was really unique as far as Americans are concerned, of any hue. What does the diplomat do? It is not all cocktail parties and receptions. It is very dangerous at times. And you are the key person, when you're the ambassador, responsible for up to 500 or 600 Americans in the country where you are serving. So that's a heavy-duty responsibility. But it's also one that has joy attached to some of the challenges. And the story came about really, after I began my oral history.
Okay, so tell us what the oral history was about.
The Library of Congress now hosts the history of American diplomats, and now a few more African-American diplomats, telling about how they began their career, what were the key challenges, the key successes in their lives, and what it was like to be a trailblazer. Being a female, and a female of color, was by far more difficult than being just plain African-American. I think it was the skirt that was the challenge. And I saw so many young women who wanted to do what I did, and it wasn't until we had Madeleine Albright become Secretary of State that many females felt that they could rise to that level. There were not many women ambassadors, much less senior women in the diplomatic service. So we had to actually file a lawsuit so that women could get senior positions in the State Department.
As quiet as it's kept. That's the first time I've heard that. So this was after Madeleine Albright.
This is before Albright came secretary. This is in the early 70s. Okay. And up until 1971, women could not be married in the diplomatic service. Once you got married, you resigned.
Did you say 1971?
That's what I said. I didn't say 51, 1971. Wow, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I want to backtrack a little bit to just make sure that our Dreamcatchers get a little bit more information about you. So you mentioned that you're a former diplomat, ambassador, and professor. You held numerous posts abroad for a course of 42 years, career all within the State Department.
All within the State Department. I served in Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, Senegal, Mali, the Ivory Coast, which is now Côte d'Ivoire, France, Belgium, and then I returned to Senegal 28 years after I had been a junior diplomat as the U.S. ambassador. That was very special.
And that's very impressive. So you retired in 2005 after the 42-year career. Was there anything in particular that moved you to retire at that time, or it was just...
Really, you're required as a career diplomat to retire at age 65. And so I went to Orlando, Florida, thinking I would spend 1 year as the diplomat in residence at the University of Central Florida. And I've been there 15 years.
Okay, and so it was in that experience of teaching the students that the idea came up for the book. Okay, Okay, so what was your process in writing it? You're a first-time author. Did you seek advice from other authors? Did you take any writing classes? How did you approach that process?
I was so pleased to have found a co-author who knew how to do research, who happened to be white American, who learned more about my black history than I could ever have known, because no book that is a memoir is going to be effective if you don't know from whence you came. I also knew that I was not a Kardashian. My name wasn't Hillary, and it wasn't Madeleine Albright. And yet I loved the history of memoirs of women diplomats. So this was going to be a rather difficult sell. So I had 5 rejections from publishing houses, and I really didn't want to be a self-publisher. I wanted the book to have credibility in university sectors, because otherwise it could not be what one would say marketed to gender studies, studies of international affairs and female diplomats, and to women of color. So therefore, I was patient, and when the University of Nebraska Press, which now owns Potomac Books, which I remember reading when I was in college, said that they wanted to publish my book, I was over the moon. But it was a 3-year process of writing, rewriting, listening to the oral history, recognizing that my sentence structures in this oral history made absolutely no sense on paper. It required discipline that I did not know I had, saying no to go to social events because you had a deadline. And then you had to edit and edit and edit. Time consuming. Wasn't always fun, but I knew I had a goal that I wanted to reach. And if I teach my children, students that is, to be disciplined, I had to set an example.
Right. Wow. Okay, so that, just to put that in context in terms of your process, so you looked at printing, you looked at distribution, even marketing, in that process of determining how you were going to publish the book, because how you publish it will determine how you market it, how you distribute it, how you get it printed. And so so that it took 3 years to write the book, or 3 years in the business of writing, or both?
Both. But then the question is, even if you find a publisher, an academic, the University of Nebraska Press, they don't know my community. I don't know my community, and you'll hear this tomorrow, because I've been out of the United States for 35 years. So thanks to the Terry Williams Agency, I was introduced to my world in the United States. It has been a marriage made in heaven, and I am so pleased that now I know the various blog sites. I know what reaches the millennials, what reaches my community. I grew up when there was just Ebony and Essence, and I read in the...
And Jet?
And Jet, of course, and Jet. Simeon Booker followed me around the world and made sure people knew where this little Elam girl from Roxbury, Massachusetts, was on her next assignment. It was fascinating because when he passed away, we lost, again, a lot of that connection, especially since we were abroad. But I made it my business to be sure the book is one that is readable. It is not filled with theory. There are scores of anecdotes which bring to life the work that you must do and decisions you have to make. And it always reminds you, never forget from whence you came. You've been a woman of color, you were Negro, you were colored, Negro, Black, African-American, Afro-American. Now I'm a woman of color. In the 42 years I was overseas, the nomenclature for who I happen to be has changed, but I've always known, I knew I was of African descent, and proud of it.
Okay, well said. So just the technical aspects of the process of writing, did you outline? Did you plot it out? How did you approach the process? And this I'm asking for 2 reasons. One, because it's a memoir, which is a little bit different than how you may write a fiction or nonfiction tale. And then the other, because of what you're writing about, that the profession and the research, that there's your life, and then there's probably some other additional research that you wanted to bring in to the book is kind of what I'm hearing. So the process in being a new author and how you approached it, and then also being a memoir, which is not the usual.
First of all, being a memoir in nonfiction, working for the Department of State. You've got to be very careful how you couch certain historical events because it all has to be cleared by the State Department.
So you were still employed with the State Department when you...
But you cannot provide state secrets in your book. The other is that I did have a timeline of my career. I began my career during the Vietnam peace talks in Paris. I was a secretary at that time at the American Embassy in Paris with a degree in international relations. The first question they ask any woman is, do you know how to type? So I spent 2 years in Paris, 3 years, as a secretary in the political section, and I realized my parents made this sacrifice for me to go to school to get a degree from 1965 to 68. That's the time the peace talks were taking place in Paris. The civil rights movement has come to the fore in the United States, and the French students are tearing up the left bank because they want freedom of speech, freedom of whatever. And so I decided the one way that this book would have credibility is to tie it to historical events in international affairs where I was present. So I began tying everything that was important to me, difficult for me, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, what transpired also in the interim with the SALT talks and the whole Iran Gate issue. All of these things are part and parcel of my book because I was overseas representing America, trying to explain some of these horrendous things that were happening at home. Now, they're mild in comparison to today, and I will say that it is a challenge to inspire young men and women to consider this career because I'm very happy I've retired from the Foreign Service because I cannot imagine myself explaining how the U.S. government functions, the Electoral College, and why we do what we do today.
Which that conversation is different from having the conversation as an overseas diplomat and having that conversation with the foreign audience versus the people here who are in the trenches and know what's going on. CNN and all the other news outlets, everyone is out there and they're reporting it. And so that there's more of a challenge.
Much more of a challenge. Why? Because we have news 24 hours a day. And the key is breaking news. We're not really certain it is correct or accurate, but we've got breaking news. So that happened with the first Gulf War, and I talk about that in the book, because we were saying things then that were not really true in terms of how we invaded Iraq, on the whole Kuwait issue, and there was a friend of mine who was ambassador to Kuwait at the time, and it really let us know that we couldn't rely completely on breaking news. And I say so that my students don't get disillusioned, there are still diplomats out there today working in the trenches, still doing positive things to develop a credible relationship with our counterparts abroad, despite all that what we hear is going on today.
So with breaking news, what we are finding today is many times it is true that the news outlets will get the news before the diplomats, before the ambassadors to spread.
Now, but that used to be the case. Okay. But now that tells you the role of the ambassador has changed significantly. When there was a potentiality of war, the ambassador went into what we call a bubble, a secure room, got on the phone to the State Department Operations Center and informed them what is likely to happen. Today, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, you name it, will be there on the ground and know about it before, maybe at the same time as the ambassador in country would know.
And reporting it.
But they're reporting it without the context of the cultural context, the political sensitivities, and what people who have been involved in that country know and really need to provide that context to the reporters. That doesn't always happen.
And what are the inherent problems with that?
Sound bites. So you get something that sounds very glib and people will catch on to it, but it will never tell you what was the real issue. Why were students demonstrating? An example I will give you, in Gezi in Istanbul, Turkey, Gezi Park, there was a huge demonstration, we thought, in Istanbul about 4 years ago. And when I looked at it on the news, I knew the park. I'd lived there. It's not much bigger than the space that we have in this room. And you would have thought the entire city of Istanbul, Turkey, of 18 million people was in flames. But that was not the case. You can't know that unless you've lived there. And you talk to a diplomat who was in the American Press Center, because every embassy has a press attaché whose role is to follow the news and to interact with visiting journalists and to help them have access to leading newspapers that are, we would hope, credible and telling the story straightforward.
I'm sure you have an opinion. Do you want to share your opinion about this most recent, how can I put it? The current president, President Trump, had alluded to, because I believe it was backtracked a little bit, but the whole discussion about having the Russian ambassador go and be questioned, or what are your? Do you want to share your thoughts about that? Can you?
One, I am a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. It's headed by Ron Newman, former ambassador to Afghanistan. We wrote a letter to the White House saying that this is a non-starter. There was a group of women ambassadors. We, too, were going to follow up, but we realized that might have been a bit of overkill, because you are not going to put your chief of mission, that's the terminology for an ambassador, his or her life in the hands of someone else to answer questions. We swear, we take an oath of office that's very similar to every member of Congress and to the head of state, to be true to our Constitution and country. There is no way on this earth that we could feel comfortable about allowing that to happen. We were outraged. I, along with all of them. That's my opinion. So it's not going to happen, by the way.
Yes, I heard the backtrack on that, and it sounds like a lot of it had to do with the letter. That
there were about 400 of us now, members of the Academy, and in order to be voted into the Academy, you had to have had 2 senior positions in government to even be a candidate to be a member of the Academy for Diplomacy. And I was amazed that in 2009 I was voted in, and I'd forgotten I'd been the acting director of the U.S. Information Agency before I became ambassador to Senegal. But that is absolutely my view and the view of every career diplomat.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's jump back into the book. You mentioned that it took 3 years to write it, to edit it.
I began writing. I did not outline. The outline was the historical events that took place. So I began from 1968 through July of 2015, when I was in Cuba, when Obama's letter was delivered to the Foreign Ministry reopening that embassy. The briefer was a young man of color who I had mentored for 10 years.
Do you want to give a shout out?
His name is Justin Davis, and I'm so proud of him. I don't break down in tears much, but we have a delegation of 14 people in Cuba in the then U.S. interest section, and he said, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for this woman. Young African-American male, fluent in Spanish, was the ambassador's political officer, and he convinced our ambassador to come and speak to the delegation I was with, which was absolutely mind-boggling. So that was the process. Again, the writing from 1968 through 2015. It was full circle because I had become a university professor, which is what led me to writing this book.
Just the order of events is just extraordinary. It was meant to be.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. So in the process, what were some of the challenges that you faced in writing the book?
When you're writing a book that's nonfiction and it's a memoir, the dates have to be correct. The facts have to be correct. I knew Kissinger had done something and the world was angry with America in Cambodia. Not Kissinger, Nixon. And I couldn't remember, and I really could not remember how to even Google it to find it. And thank goodness there were research assistants who did that for me. Because if you're not going to tell it correctly, don't even write, because the world is very critical. They will tear you apart, especially if you happen to look like me.
They're going to fact check you to death.
twice as much as anybody else. Talk about Serena having certain samples all the time. They would fact check everything in that book. So that was very difficult. You can't rely on your memory. And even though you think you have the spelling of a country's name correct, you better triple check it. Because again, the editors will say, no, that's not correct. Or the reviewers, who will be very difficult, will let you know that they actually said there was a bit too much detail in my book. And my niece said, don't worry. A critique has to have a criticism. Yes. If it's all bland and says you're the best thing that's in sliced bread, it has no credibility.
We call those sleepers.
That I didn't know, so I was a little concerned. She said, no, don't worry. That's Kierkegaard's publishers. When they do that, you should be thankful. I said, oh, thank you. Criticize me all you want. But it was important to have your facts correct, the timeline correct, and then don't allow yourself to get into too many war stories. Okay. I had to ratchet that back. Too many anecdotes.
Okay. So how involved were you in the process of marketing your book?
I relied when I first realized that, I'll be very honest with you, publishing houses are not going to take care of my book the way they take care of certain other diplomats who don't look like me.
I've heard a lot of authors say that, actually, across genres.
Whether it's fiction or nonfiction. That's right. They're not going to market it. They're not going to find the little store that is near Howard University, that's going to be in Atlanta, in underground Atlanta, or at Spelman College, where I taught at one point. No, they're not going to do that because that's not unless you have someone on your staff. So that's why I was so pleased to be able to engage with the Terry Williams Agency, which is what opened my eyes to a community of my own that reads and is curious about things that are not talked about in the news very much. I have friends now who write and say to me, we listen to this business about trying to get the U.S. ambassador to Russia to go overseas and testify. We're thinking about you, Harriet. They might not have done that if they hadn't known about my book.
So one of the, with going with a publisher, you're saying in the marketing, you have to do a lot of marketing yourself as well as whatever.
Who really knows, and the Terry Williams Agency knew.
Okay, perfect. So in our season 3 of The Writer's Haven, we have added a segment to ask revealing questions about the author, just so that the readers can get more of a sense about the author that they adore, not just in their writing, but just in who you are, the person. So I have 3 questions for you. The first is, who's your favorite author? You can name 3 or less.
Alice Walker, James Baldwin. And the third is probably, I enjoyed Madeleine Albright's memoirs, and she's written 2. And because she broke ground when nobody was looking for a woman to be Secretary of State, I was thrilled.
Okay, and 3 of your favorite books. So it sounds like one of them would be one written by Madeleine Albright.
Yes, it's Madam Secretary, when she became Secretary of State. Okay. The other is James Baldwin's Fire the Next Time, and of course, Color Purple.
Okay. And what are some of your greatest accomplishments on your writer's journey? And then we're going to close it out with talking more about you as an ambassador and advice that you would give. But what are some of your greatest accomplishments as a writer?
And finding my own voice. I didn't know that I really had a story to tell. And when I talk about being the little Elam girl from Roxbury, Massachusetts, and we decided on Roxbury as opposed to Boston in the title of the book, because Roxbury is where black people lived. It was the hood. And it needed to be highlighted, and people in Roxbury now are so pleased to see that. And secondly, to be inspirational to a generation of men and women of color, to say that if this person who grew up in the ghetto could do this in representing America abroad, to learn Greek at 42 and Turkish at 47, and to get a Turkish newspaper to write an apology to the Americans because you did the entire meeting in Turkish, I think, but you had the facts correct. That was another thing which I considered an accomplishment. To have Alvin Ailey and Dance Theater of Harlem come to Greece and be published, be filmed, and their performances be televised throughout Greece during the height of anti-Americanism in Greece, showing that our culture had value. And it so happened to be people of color who were building America's image abroad when it was at its lowest. Gave me a great sense of pride.
Okay, any advice for young people or people who are aspiring writers, either one?
Allow yourself to fail, because I had been successful despite the usual challenges of being female and black throughout my career. But intellectually, if I could learn Greek and Turkish in those ages and speak French for the last 50, 60 years, I was feeling pretty good about myself. But then I knew that I didn't really know how to create something that would build interest when people were reading. I had to include a little intrigue in a story, and I couldn't gild the lily. I had to be honest. So my advice would be, recognize you have a story to tell. Write it down in very simple language to begin with. Then you can embellish it with real-life examples. Tie them to what is happening in your city, in your community, so that it will always have relevance and become a classic. I never thought about that before, but also be willing to know that you haven't really been the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's a leveling experience. It really was. It still is. And I learned that I had so many people who were supportive of me as I went on a brand new journey of becoming a writer. And I'm very pleased that I did so.
And we are very pleased that you shared your book with us, your experience with us. And let me just show our Dreamcatchers audience again. It's called Diversifying Diplomacy by Harriet Lee Elam-Thomas. So you can go out, grab it, and
Amazon, and the website is www.diversifyingdiplomacy.com. Okay. And there is a Twitter feed and Facebook page. And my students talk about me being a rather difficult teacher on the website, which I think many young people will enjoy. But in the final analysis, they felt it was worth being in my diplomacy course.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Harriet, for spending this time with us in the Haven. And Dreamcatchers, we're going to let you know when this show will air. She is our third or fourth season 3 guest, and we're very excited to have her. So thank you very much for joining us. And we're going to continue on with one-on-one interviews during our time at the National Book Club Conference. Hashtag NBCC 2018. And so just join us at any time. Also hit the Twitter feed. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Until then, catch fire on purpose.
Oh, yeah, yes. So much fun. Mwah. Yeah, Dad. We're getting so wet.